All right, we're live with Michael Kummer. How's it going, man?
It's going. It's going. It's been incredibly busy, but fun.
Awesome. Well, yeah, we've been hanging out here and there for years. I always see you at the conferences. And so if people don't know who Michael is, he's kind of like me, where he's sort of a jack of all trades, like sort of an expert in all the diet, lifestyle, fitness, biohacking, even regenerative ag, homesteading, so many things. Super good shape too. Like if he says something about fitness, believe him because you're incredibly fit. I just posted my 42-year-old photo. That yeah, I got some hate though. It's like, I feel like I look good, but, there's always the haters. They're like, "Oh, this guy's arms are so skinny," and, they always have their critiques. I'm like, "Yeah, my arms are pretty skinny actually." But I feel like I'm in good shape.
You are. You are. I'm like, wow, you're really ripped. Good for you.
Well, thanks, but I will admit I am a slimmer person. Like I said, like slimmer arms and legs. I'm trying. I gotta put more hours in. But yeah, people can check out my Hard 30 program. I kind of just made it because so many people ask me, "What's your routine?" Like, hey, it's only an hour a week. I just do the minimum effective dose. I'm out there 30 minutes push day, 30 minutes pull day. That's it in the gym. I sprint. I do other stuff. I play volleyball, but I don't think you need tons in the gym. You can do more than me. I don't know. How long do you spend in the gym?
Strength training is once a week too. Not every week actually. I do CrossFit, and so there is usually a strength component, but it's not that I have leg day once a week or I do squats once a week. It's very as much like you. I try to maintain and beat in the inflation that is time and not get weaker. I don't need to get stronger at my age. I'm fine, but as you said, you don't need to do a whole lot of gym time to just maintain what you have or to improve if you're not where you want to be, assuming that your lifestyle, is conducive to overall health. And I think that's a big factor. Sleep, and all of the things that you do right. If you don't do them right, you might have to mitigate more and spend more time in the
Mhm.
gym, but I'd rather spend time on something else.
Yeah, and the nutrition component,
Exactly.
obviously, which
Yeah.
we'll get into. But yeah, you'll notice Michael has an accent. He's from Austria. We're going to touch on that too. I've been having a lot of different people from around the world. Most recently was Stephen from Ireland. I've done, Sami, Frederick, the Sami reindeer herder. I've done
Mhm.
the Greenland. I'm doing everywhere. So we're going to touch on Austria today. They're not doing so well these days in health. They were pretty healthy. I want to tease that and come back to that because we want to lay out a framework for what we're talking about today. And I like your idea of like there's two camps, right? Generally in the health world, there's this biohacking camp, and then there's the more natural farmers or sapien type people that are just doing it all natural, and they're in their own world. So before I start you off, I just also want to say just sapien. Sapien is my philosophy, and sapien to me means living like humans should, which is more of that simple lifestyle, doing the sunlight and the nutrition, simple foods. We don't need 1,000 supplements, all that stuff. I actually finally made sapien.org built out a little more where you can see what sapien is. It's supposed to be a diet, a lifestyle, a movement. Like this is a philosophy. So I just wanted to throw that out there as well. This Michael's a true sapien. Like we're totally in line with all these things. And let's start it off with talking about the difference between there's kind of like the Brian Johnson camp, like
Yeah.
the I'm going to live forever and I look like
Mhm.
a vampire who's already dead, and the more natural camp. So,
Yeah.
yeah, how do you see those camps like sort of not communicating?
Right, right. Yeah. The funny thing is, I did not start out raising livestock. We came from the biohacking, angle where, we met at conferences and stuff, typically biohacking conferences, right? Where you have like a million gadgets that can help you with X, Y, Z. And there is a lot of good information in the biohacking world. There's a lot of stuff that have really helped me improve my health, be it, avoidance of environmental toxins, making our home healthier, learning more about how certain foods impact our health and all of those good things. Even using something like blue light blocking glasses if you cannot avoid
Mhm.
artificial light at night, whatever. There's a lot of good information, but most of those in the biohacking space don't really grow their own food. So they're not the farmers. They advocate for grass-fed, grass-finished beef and all of those good things, but they're not really involved in food production, right? And then there are the homesteaders, which that's an area where we got into because we realized that it's all great about, eating grass-fed, grass-finished and pasture-raised eggs and stuff. But what you find in the store doesn't necessarily meet the requirements or my specific, threshold of what constitutes healthy food. Like, for example, all the chicken that you buy in the store is usually Cornish cross. That's a junk food. It's fat babies that we butcher at 8 weeks that grow incredibly quickly. So they can't even walk. They can't reproduce. They can't do nothing. Just sit next to the feeder and eat all day. And then that's the pastured chicken that we eat. And I'm like, that's not gonna fly. I don't want to eat that. I want to raise my own chickens.
Because isn't there some, like, loopholes where they open a gate for, like, an hour and then they're like, "Hey, it's on a pasture because the
Yeah,
gate's
yeah.
open."
Yeah, yeah. And they're obviously, then the nuance is, okay, how much pasture do they really have? What do they, eat additionally? Because they not just eat what they find on pasture. They get supplemental feed that might be then high in corn and soy and PUFAs, overall polyunsaturated fatty acids, which then end up in the meat and, change the fatty acid composition of the bird. And the fatty acid composition of monogastric animals is not ideal as to start with. And so I'm like, okay, I don't want to do this. We need to be involved in food production. We cannot, and even if you find someone who, raises that perfect chicken, slow growing breed and whatever, they feed the proper diet. If it's produced in a USDA certified inspected environment, the chicken was bathed in chlorine. I know I don't want to have a carcass that was bathed in chlorine, just so it's healthier for me and I don't get sick.
Mhm.
And so all of this really led us to understand that we need to raise our own food. We need to get involved. And so that's when we started homesteading. And as part of our homesteading journey, we realized that most people in the homesteading realm think just because they grow their own food, they're going to be healthy, right? Completely disregarding all of that knowledge. You don't realize, well, you still get exposed to the same oxalates and suffer potentially the consequences, and the same goes with everything else. And we've noticed by just looking around and following other homesteaders, they don't necessarily look how I envision a metabolically healthy human to look like, kind of like you and I. They are overweight, obese, have skin issues, or signs of autoimmune kind of type of conditions. And I'm like, what are they missing? Well, they are missing a lot of the things that I've learned on the biohacking side, but from them I've learned a lot about raising your own food and how to raise them, your food regeneratively and to make better choices in providing an environment that mimics how animals would, you know, live in nature without human intervention. And so I think it's incredibly important to kind of bring those two sides together and to exchange knowledge, like having a surgeon and someone from internal medicine. If they never talk to each other, they might be missing out on a whole lot of information that's required for a certain intervention. And the same goes with biohacking and homesteading. I think there is you need to bridge those things, and that goes back really to the idea of being a sapien. We've been doing things in the past that probably didn't require a whole lot of gadgets, but it required expertise that was acquired over a long, long time, and some of that has been forgotten.
That's exactly what I'm trying to do. It's bridge the gap and use the best of both worlds and look to the past. Not everything in the past is perfect or good,
Right.
right? It's not like every single thing we've done is something we need to do now. I always say we don't need to go back and live like cavemen. But a lot of those things have a tradition for a reason.
Yeah.
Like cultures figured out to soak grains or ferment sourdough or to pressure cook beans or to only eat spinach when it's available and not
Yes.
every day in a
Hmm.
kale shake like I did and have terrible oxalate issues that I
Yes.
still am trying to. Yeah, it's terrible. like how oxalates are a huge deal. Just to do a few more minutes on the oxalates. It's like I was doing that every day for years
Mm,
back like 8 years ago, drinking the spinach and the kale and the almond milk, and I thought I was so healthy.
yeah,
And it's terrible for your kidneys. They built up. I still am trying to get oxalates out of my kidneys.
yeah, and it's the unfortunate thing is, those oxalates, they are one of the few anti-nutrients that you cannot mitigate, or at least I'm not aware of any mechanism. There is no heating, fermenting, sprouting, soaking, boiling that would get rid of those oxalate crystals, right? And so the only option is avoidance or consumption in moderation. If you only eat your spinach once a year during a 2-week period, you're probably gonna be fine if you're metabolically somewhat healthy. But as if you do what you did, having that raw spinach and kale smoothie every single day for years, you'll suffer the consequences, unfortunately, and most people don't know that.
Well, yeah, or just have it here and there, right?
Yes,
Like, yeah, if you just don't buy spinach and, okay, every couple of weeks I have a spinach salad at some restaurant. Okay, who
mhm,
cares? Like,
yeah,
that's not gonna kill you. Yeah.
right. Yeah, absolutely right. Yeah, and the same goes with, a lot of other things that we have just forgotten, not just, what we eat, but how we eat things, how we prepare things, and that obviously involves you being part of the process, and ideally part of the, raising that or growing that food, but definitely part of the cooking and preparing the food. Because if you leave that to someone else, you've already lost, because nobody gives a crap about your health. If it's not you, nobody else does, right?
Mhm. That's a good point too. Yeah, not many people know about all these techniques. I've had Dr. Bill Schindler on, who's traveled around the world and
Hmm.
learned more about these cooking techniques and why they do them, and the soaking and the sprouting and so many things to them. So yeah, what are some other like simple ones that people should know about?
When it comes to preparation,
Yeah, yeah, just yeah,
yeah.
like what yeah.
I mean, one of the easier things you can do is remove the seeds and the skin of whatever vegetable you eat, for the most part, like potatoes, and going back to Dr. Bill Schindler, I mean, he's a great guy, and he introduced us to the concept of fermenting potatoes, right? It would have never occurred to me that, yes, we always, for the most part, we peeled potatoes anyway, but just slicing them up or cutting them into fries, putting them into a saline solution for 2-3 days, that reduces the glycemic index, and that reduces the toxicity of the potato at the end of the day. And then you eat it, and it tastes just as good, if not better. And you can have potatoes and probably more often than if you just eat a regular potato with the skin on and get all of the toxins of that plant.
Mhm.
And that's mostly true for tubers, who use the skin as the barrier to protect what's inside from the environment. I mean, that is the most defended part of that plant. And but just doing something as simple as peeling, you make that food significantly healthier than not doing it.
Yeah, yeah, I learned lacto fermentation from him too.
Hmm.
And then there's also just even pressure cooking beans. I remember learning that. That was probably from the Plant Paradox book, Stephen Gundry,
Hmm.
talking about lectins and that, pressure cooking beans gets rid of a lot of lectins. You said removing the seeds. Yeah, like if for the like bell peppers or stuff like that, right? You can even remove that little skin barrier. Is that right?
You can. I mean, honestly, one thing that I've learned is, I mean, you can go crazy with every single thing that you do and probably stress out about, oh, I have to. A good example is not the bell pepper, but the tomato. We had a time where we said, well, we have to remove the seeds and we have to remove the skin. If you do this with a tomato, there is literally nothing left. What are you gonna eat? I mean, a little bit of flesh seems that it's not worth even eating. I mean, that's when we stopped eating tomatoes for a while, and then I'm like, you know what? We grow our own tomatoes organically and the whole nine yard, heirloom kind of variety. And I've realized that by just eating the tomato as it is, I'm perfectly fine. Because I don't eat it every day either. But having tomatoes once a week or so with the seeds, with the skin, I appear to be doing just fine with that. Likely also because my toxic load overall is low enough so that my body can handle those tomatoes once a week. Right. So there is also, I think, some individuality. How do you respond to a certain food? Maybe you have to be stricter with tomatoes than with bell peppers, or the other way around. So I think it's a lot about kind of being in tune with your body and finding out what works for you. Now, we all have a limit. And that threshold, we should not cross. But within that, I think there is a lot of wiggle room, if you will, if you do most of your life right. If you're like an 80-20 kind of guy and I say, you know what, 80% I'm going to do right. And within those 20%, I have some wiggle room to figure out what can I get away with without suffering the consequences, right? And I've noticed that, for example, or my wife has really noticed with sourdough bread, there is almost no wiggle room for her. She
Mm.
does not do well with sourdough. It doesn't matter how, if we double fermented and organic flour and the whole 9 yard, she's not doing well with it. So regardless of what an influencer says, how healthy sourdough is or raw dairy, none of us do well with raw cow dairy. Not A2, grass fed, the whole, as best as we can have it from a local farm just a few miles from here, we don't do well with dairy. And some people say raw dairy is like the best things in sliced bread. Well, maybe for some, not for us. And so that's another, I think, nuance. You really have to listen and don't be too convinced of something if it just doesn't work for you.
No, that's so important. It's so important because there's a lot of influencers out there, and yeah, I mean, I'm pro raw milk, but I'm not saying that everyone has to do it or
Yeah.
that it's going to work for everyone. 100%. Can you do goat's milk?
I do better, but I've also noticed that, well, the goat milk we have access to is not raw. So again, there is, but
Hmm.
with the low heat pasteurized goat milk that we have access to, I seem to be doing better. My wife,
No.
still no
Well,
go.
yeah. Yeah, there's definitely different genetics going on, different history of your ancestors and what they ate. There's so
Yes.
much there. But I love that point in general is that there's nuance, there's 80-20 rules. Like, absolutely. I don't wanna take anything for granted. I was gonna say there's a lot of influencers talking about different things, like, this is the best thing, this is the worst thing. It's always somewhere in between.
Yes.
And the human body is made to be resilient. But if you have too many bad inputs coming in, you can't be resilient. I think the
Yes.
same thing happened to me. Once I cleaned up my diet, my allergies went away, right? All
Mhm.
these things went away because my body had to fight off less toxins, less bad inputs, right? So
Yes.
now the allergies didn't affect me because it had more bandwidth
Mhm.
to deal with them. And so again, if yeah, you have amazing life diet and lifestyle, and yes, you can handle tomatoes. I do not freak out about tomatoes, but I
Yeah.
get it. There's nightshades. My business partner actually had terrible problems with tomatoes. Doesn't eat
Mhm.
tomatoes. Fine, good. I can eat tomatoes once in a while. Doesn't matter.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And that's really the problem, in our world now, where there are so many opinions. I mean, I think there are frameworks that we probably do very well with if we just followed them. Like the sapient type of framework.
Mhm.
Within that, there is wiggle room. You don't have to be a strict carnivore. You obviously don't want to be a strict vegan, as far as I'm concerned. But there is something in between, and your exact path really depends on a lot of factors. And I think that you mentioned, your body has now more bandwidth to deal with toxins. I think stress is also a major factor overall, because stress causes resource constraints, right? If you're under a lot of chronic stress, your body has less resources to deal with other things. And I've noticed this over and over again. And, we're going to talk about Austria then in a little bit. I'm Austrian. I grew up in Austria. I spent 20 odd years of my life in Austria. My grandparents are still alive. They're 92 and 93. I see how they eat. I see how my brother eats. We obviously have very comparable genetics, yet we are entirely different as well. We eat differently. My mom, my dad, they live a slower life overall. And they, as I believe, I strongly believe, they can get away with more less than ideal choices than I can in our more fast paced, you know, American life here,
Stressful
where,
world, yeah.
yeah,
Way more stressful, way more stressors everywhere. Yeah, way more toxins, whatever.
yeah,
Yeah. Well, yeah. We'll get back to Austria and that concept in a second, but I still wanted to cover why I think some of these homesteader type people aren't as healthy as they could be. Okay, and you brought up raw dairy, which I think is good, and you brought up sourdough, which I think is good. It's the best version of bread. But these
right.
are two things that if you're in this homesteading world or natural world, people are like, these are superfoods. Butter's a superfood. Cream's a superfood.
Hmm.
Sourdough's a superfood. I'm like, what are you talking about? No, no, no. These are best versions. These are
Yeah,
fine. This is
yeah,
good sources of fat. They are good sources, of carbs. It's not a superfood. And
no.
it goes back to the nutrient to energy ratio, which is something I'm really interested in, right? This is like why any diet can be good or bad is you're looking at the nutrient to energy ratio. And
Mhm,
so I've developed a similar opinion when I see some of these like Weston A. Price conference type people and they're obsessed with butter and sourdough and they don't look very healthy.
mhm.
So it's like these things are high energy, right? There's not, I mean, of course, there's fat soluble vitamins in butter, right? And there's some things in, a good sourdough, you can get some, decent, I don't know, there's not that many vitamins and minerals there. But anyway, if you can get some whole grain, there's something there, right? There's
Yeah, yeah.
some stuff in there. But if you are eating a ton of these things, "Oh, I made my own jam, and these are, my own sweeteners and my own honey and all this stuff, my own butter, my own bread." That's a lot of energy and not a lot of nutrients.
Yes,
But they're not bad. I eat those foods, but it's in the correct ratio. So I think that's
yes.
maybe one thing that maybe they're not considering in that world.
Yeah, I'm sure that's a big, big factor, if and especially, pastries and baking and all of those things are big in the homesteading world, we the other day we watched, someone making jam because we were looking for a jam recipe so we could, turn some of our raspberries into jam. And I mean, most of those recipes followed by homesteaders, they call like for a 1-to-1 ratio of fruit to sugar, just regular, white sugar. I mean, if you have, 4 pounds of raspberries and then you add 4 pounds of sugar, I mean, that's the amount of sugar I probably consume not even in a year,
Yeah.
you know? And then you have a couple of jars of jelly that you then eat because it's there, in a matter of weeks, and you suddenly consume 4 pounds of processed sugar in 4 weeks, but it's, homemade jelly. It's healthy from our own garden, at least the fruit is. I'm like, well, I don't know about that because, after boiling the fruit and everything, it's basically stripped of all micronutrients that were in the fresh fruit. And then it's basically just sugar
It's
that
stripped
tastes
of its
good.
structure too. I'm big
Yeah.
into the structure. I'm not big into fiber, but I'm big into the structure and
Yeah.
water and intactness of foods that
Yes. Yeah.
produce satiety signaling and stuff like that. Yeah.
Yeah. And if you think about how many raspberries do you have to eat for a tablespoon of jelly, right? And when I eat jelly, I don't eat a tablespoon, I eat more.
Mhm.
And so you think about, okay, how much fruit do I consume in addition to how much of the sugar I consume? And then you get like into areas where I'm like, okay, this is not natural. This is not how, what humans would have eaten, depending on, back in the days, depending on how long you think humans have been around. And the same goes with other things, having then sourdough every single day and having, and I think the other nuance to this is having amounts that my grandparents never had. They just got by. They just tried to fulfill their caloric needs every single day, and many days they came short. We don't come short. We probably eat significantly more because we have access to the food and we don't need to move much for it. Even if you're a homesteader, the other day I was thinking there was one lady gardening, and say, oh, I don't know, I don't need the gym. I'm working outside. Well, I'm like, that's great, if you pull weeds or whatever and you sweat in the sun. But then if it comes to, moving feed barrels or whatever, you use the tractor. So where is the lifting part? Where is the exertion? And I thought about this while I was transferring 1,600 pounds of feed that was delivered in a pallet by hand into individual drums. So I was, using a bucket to move 1,600 pounds from A to B. And I'm like, okay, this is the workout. But using a tractor or machinery to do that, just because you're sweating in the sun, that's not the same thing. You're not expending the same amount of energy. And so there is a lot of kind of half truths, I guess, that people just buy into. Yes, making my own jelly is fine, or working in the garden, that's I'm doing my exercise. But you're not.
Mhm.
That's not how my grandparents would farm because there was no heavy machinery. There was no 4 pounds of sugar that they because it was expensive at the time that they could make jelly with. So it's different, and those differences
Mm.
they are forgotten, but they make a difference.
It's huge. Yeah, to preserve your muscle mass is so important. And I'm not saying people need to be a bodybuilder at all, but you need to preserve your muscle mass in old age. I actually had a quick story yesterday. It was so crazy. I was driving and this old man like tipped over. He like tripped on a scooter. You know those scooters that
Mhm.
people
Yeah,
ride
yeah.
around, that shared scooter?
Uh,
He tripped over it, I guess. His he could not get up. He was stranded in the street. His head was like in the middle of the street. I pulled over, like ran over, and he could not get up. Like, this
mhm,
man was 80, he was, looked like he was fine, like, he looked like he was in good shape. He had no muscle to even
mhm.
get himself up. He
Yeah,
was lying there for a while,
yeah.
and I had to, like, really, use all my muscle that I've built in the gym to, like, pick him up. It was
Yeah.
hard, and I was like,
Mhm.
"Wow, this guy, if he was in the middle of nowhere, he would have died." Like, this
Yeah,
man could not get up,
yeah,
and that is scary. That's how you die, and you're not gonna build enough muscle gardening. I think gardening is amazing, great, fantastic,
yeah,
applaud everyone, but, like, you gotta get a little more than that.
yeah, yeah. Absolutely. That's really I believe in, just moving. I don't think you need to do endurance or, run marathons or any of that, but you need to move in the form of walking, you need to sprint occasionally, and you need to lift heavy stuff. Because if you don't have a stimulus for that, your all of your structure says, well, I if I don't need to lift any weight, then I can get weaker. I don't need it. That's as simple as it is. If you load your structure with weights, your bones and your ligaments and your muscles respond by saying, we need to get stronger, otherwise we're not going to be able to do this, right? And so again, you don't need to be a bodybuilder, but you need to maintain. And if you don't lift heavy, you're not going to maintain. You get weaker. That's the
Absolutely, and we're not also talking about every 80-year-old needs to go, like, get out some dumbbells and barbells. It's just do something, just even like air squats.
yes, yeah,
Something like get enough power and strength to get yourself off the ground or to prevent yourself from falling. That's a classic one people talk about these days too, right? It's like
yeah,
you break a hip, you don't have the balance, you don't have the strength, you break a hip and you're healthy and then all of a sudden you die.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And there are two problems in there, as one is the inability to keep balance and to not fall because you cannot even support your own weight and body at the end of the day. And the second thing is then your bone density is so poor that it breaks just because you fall down. If I fall down, I'm not going to break a bone. Something significantly with more force has to hit me to
Mhm.
break a bone, right? And so, how do you make bone stronger? Well, again, you lift weight, and ideally a little bit more than your own body. So you're always ahead of the curve a little bit. You don't need to get significantly stronger, but you need to be just a little bit more than what your own body weight, because as we get older, stuff is slower,
Mm.
and you are more likely to lose if you don't
Mm,
counteract it. And the way you counteract it is to load a little bit more weight.
that's a good point. I mean, you could grab anything in your house if you don't need a gym. If you're an older
No.
person, you can grab a 10-pound item from your
Yeah.
house and just do squats, like a goblet squat with it in
Yeah.
your hands.
Yeah.
So, let's move more to Austria
Yeah.
because you talked about your parents and they're old, right? They're still kicking around.
Yeah. Yeah. So my grandparents, 92 and 93. My parents are still around too. They're in their late 60s. And I've noticed with my grandparents that they have been healthy, or they stayed healthy for a very, very long time. I think it's been maybe in the last 10 years or so where certain lifestyle induced issues started creeping in. Like, my grandma has, like, like this white skin spots, which is an autoimmune type of condition. You can tell by that they started adopting, or they've been now, eating in a certain way and living in a certain way that is different to how they lived when they grew up. And
Mhm.
so, but because they were in a different kind of environment for so long, with they grow up on a farm, they raised had their own cows and etc. They walked to school every day. They were out in nature most of the time because there was no AC at home and none of those things. So you can really tell they had a huge buffer to stay
Mhm.
healthy for a very, very long time. And now only in the last decade or so, I can see that, the modern lifestyle that they live now has kind of, is creeping in, and it's causing some of those issues. But they're still kicking, they're still traveling. they live by themselves, so they are not in a retirement or in a nursing home or anything. So they are still relatively healthy for 90-plus-year-olds, And but again, I dug out a picture the other day from when my wife and I, shortly after we got married about 10 plus years ago, we visited them and we had lunch with them together. And if I look at what's on the table, it's bread, it's a Coca-Cola product like a Fanta or the
Mm.
Austrian version of the whatever one of those drinks. It's some veggies and salad, and it's also meat. But there was a lot of things I'm like, if again, I could not be doing this every day without paying the consequences, because
Mm.
I already grew up at a time where I did not live like my grandparents. I was not on a farm. I did not spend most of my time outside. I was not trying to just meet my caloric needs every single day. We had plenty of food. And so I'm already starting at on a foundation that's significantly worse than what my grandparents had. So I cannot do what they do and expect to live 90 years, is what I'm trying to say.
That's a good point. I've noticed some of these people that live a long time, they came from the era of real food, real
Yes.
work, and then they've slowly kind of withered away at the end, but they coast actually pretty well. If you
Yes.
have that
Yes.
super strong foundation
Ye
for 60, 70 years of your life,
yes.
then they hear the stories, they're like, "Oh, the secret to longevity, she drinks her brandy every day." You know what I
Yeah.
mean? So there's always
Yeah,
this thing that's not that healthy, but
yeah.
you can do that because you're not living like these Americans at all.
Yeah.
Most Americans, they're like pulling through McDonald's, whatever fast food, they're drinking sodas, there's a million things going on. And if this lady has her little brandy, like she has like one little portion of
Mhm.
brandy, right? Yeah,
Yeah.
and that's not gonna kill her. Or they smoke. If they smoke, they're like, "Oh, she has 1 cigarette per day or something." I'm like, "Yeah, it's not good," but your body can handle that again, right?
Yeah.
You can handle the small
Yes.
insults.
Yes. Yes. It's the sum of all the insults that we are dealing with today that are the issue. It's not about that sourdough bread you eat here or there, or that beer you might have or whatever. It's really the combination of everything. And if you really think about all of the things that we are exposed to that my grandparents were not, it's massive. From there was no BPA, there was no plastic food storage containers back in the days. I would even argue, there were no seed oils back in the days. They did use butter and tallow and lard, animal fats basically, because that's the only thing they had access to, but also in amounts that are, it's not like, oh, butter is great, so I can eat a stick of butter every day. Well, they didn't have a stick of butter per person every single day because it was expensive. They had to like use the minimum amounts to do what they wanted to do, because there was only so much butter to go around. In usually large families, they had like 11 siblings or so. So it was not like, oh, everyone got a stick of butter. No, there was a stick of butter for the entire family for the entire week,
That's
you
a
know?
great point. Yeah, it's a good healthy fat, but I don't use excess of it.
Yeah.
Right, and yeah, tell me more about Austria. What's, like, their traditional diet? What are people eating back in the day? What did your grandparents eat back in the day? And then what are they doing now? Because
Yeah, yeah.
I think they're not doing so well these days.
No, they're unfortunately not. But as far as my grandparents are concerned, especially, they grew up during the Second World War. I mean, they were maybe 7, 8 years or so old during the war, and they didn't have a lot of food. They didn't have a lot of money either, so they could only eat what they could produce, or more generally speaking, a lot of cheap stuff. Like flour at the time was obviously as cheap as it is now. And so they had a lot of dishes with grains and starches, just the cheapest stuff you can, add some cornmeal or whatever, or flour with water and some salt and maybe some butter. That might have been a dinner. So
Well,
they ate a lot of things that I don't think are necessarily good for optimal health, but that was the only thing they had, right? And they did not have any of the other bad stuff. They had a lot of the good stuff. They had access to nature. They had, you know, non-toxic homes. They had the insults that they experienced were significantly less. And so by having a less than ideal diet, that was actually relatively low in energy as well, because they were just trying to kind of get close to their caloric needs every single day. And in most days, they had to either fast. They didn't plan for intermittent fasting. They just had to do it because there was no food, or low calorie days, etc., were the norm, while at the same time a lot of physical activity because they had to work the land, they had to work the farm, they had to walk to school from an early age on. They had to run. I remember one story from my grandfather. He was running because there was a plane behind him shooting down, with a machine gun, and he had to run and escape and,
Hmm.
and hide. I mean, we don't have those are, as far as I'm concerned, hormetic stressors, right? They make you stronger and more resilient, but they don't occur every single day. They don't turn into chronic stressors. And so I think that combination allowed them to have a fairly healthy foundation despite less than optimal food choices. And of course, they cherished animal based foods whenever they had, if they slaughtered a pig or whatever, that's what they had. And that pig was not likely not fed with, GMO grains because they weren't around at the time. And so that's what they ate today. Now, fast forward, Austria has always maintained a diet that is very heavy in starches and grains, or potatoes and and wheat and flours and breads. I mean, when I grew up, I had bread every day, and it was usually paired with a sugary drink. I don't remember ever drinking just plain water.
Mm.
We had that syrup that we would mix with plain water, but it was sugar at the end of the day. And and so and meat as well. I mean, we eat a lot of meat in Austria, but it's not like Hong Kong where we eat a huge amounts of meat. Meat is typically, and has been throughout the years, expensive, and so that's not something we do eat a lot. But it's a lot of grains, a lot of carbohydrates. And now, fast forward, if you look at, for example, the Austrian food pyramid, you can see a clear trend that's been going on for several years now, where meat and animal proteins are pushed to the side in favor of plants, grains, nuts and seeds, fruits. So very much a plant leaning type
Mm.
of diet. And I looked up the food pyramid from Austria that was last updated, I think, in December of 2024, so not too long ago. And the suggestion is vegetables and fruits, 5 portions a day. I don't know exactly what the portion size is, but just in compared to some of the other items on there. So vegetables and fruits, 5 portions. Cereals and potatoes, 4 portions a day. Milk and dairy, 2 portions a day. Oils, fats, nuts, and seeds, 2 portions a day. And then legumes, more than 3 portions a week. Fish, meat, and eggs, 2 portions per week.
What?
So not even they do not recommend consuming fish, meat, and eggs every single day. 2 out of 7 days per week, you should be
Oh my
consuming
god.
those foods. That's absolutely crazy.
That's wild. And there's not good results. We talked for a second. They have more heart disease in the US now.
Yes, yeah, and in fact, if you look at the leading causes of death, number one is cardiovascular disease, number two is cancer. Um, and cardiovascular disease, or cause of death, 34.3% of all deaths in Austria are due to cardiovascular disease compared to the US. And that was mind boggling to me. In the US, it's only 22% of all deaths. So significantly higher death rate from heart disease in
Wow.
Austria.
Yeah, and well, so to go back. So before, it sounds like there was definitely a time when your grandparents didn't have, I mean, it was during the war, didn't
Mhm.
have much, didn't have a lot of food. That was not great. Had to survive on some flour and some stuff. But generally, they're producing their own food. They would have had access to eggs, right?
Yes. Yeah.
They would have
Yeah.
had, so they generally, I mean, just how everyone was back in the day is you kinda just had to get your own food.
They had
So
their garden, they grew plants
yeah.
and veggies and stuff. They had fruits, whatever would grow, seasonally. So yes, they for sure. I mean, they grew a. I would argue the majority of what they ate, they grew. Even the wheat, if they didn't grow it themselves, they would have it from a neighboring, farmer who happened to grow wheat, to make flour. So
Wow.
there was very little store-bought processed foods that, someone else made for you and you don't know how they did.
Yeah.
And I
So,
think
yeah,
that's a
that
good.
yeah, no, that's a big thing. That's kind of how I think of this now. I'm not saying people can never have some of these things. It's just like, what is the context of it? Or like, what is the proportion of it? Or yeah, there, like, was this back in the day or was this now? Or is this in Europe or is this in the US where it seems like the foods have just been modified and stepped on so much more with so many different additives or pesticides and stuff like that.
And I think the other nuance of this is, in particular in the plant world, I mean, if you look at the grains, let's say the type of wheat that they grew back then, 80 years, 90 years ago, versus the type of wheat that you buy now if you want to make your own flour. Let's say you go to the store and you buy, or you find someone who grows wheat and you
Mhm.
you you grind that down and mill it down to make your own flour. I would argue that the type of wheat is significantly different because over the years, of course, we've tried to improve, the performance of wheat to be more pest resistant. And I'm not even talking about, GMOs, but just by, hybridization and
Yeah.
selective breeding and all of the things we do to produce better plants, more pest and disease resistant. We change the proteins in those plants. And new proteins, generally speaking, it doesn't have to be true all of the time, but generally speaking, they are foreign to our immune system. Now, what happens if you introduce a new protein into your bloodstream that is unknown? Well, the immune system attacks it because it's an invader, right? And so even if you do it exactly the same way as my grandparents did back in the days, if you use modern wheat varieties, you'll probably have a different outcome.
It sounds like that's what's happened with your wife because likely she was able her ancestors were able to eat grains.
Yeah. And Costa Rica, I mean, they are very heavy into, especially, corn and, well, also rice, and they eat a lot of grains. They eat a lot of beans and legumes and all of those things. But she does not well with the varieties or the types that we have access to now. Or I mean, there are so many. We haven't tested every single variety. I should point out,
Yeah.
but at least the common ones she doesn't do well with. Well, it's likely because those are different from the ones that her ancestors grew potentially and consumed.
Yeah. And so traditionally, so I've been to Germany, I haven't been to Austria. Is it similar types of food? So what was a typical diet in general way back in the day compared to now? I mean, I'm guessing they ate meat. I know that.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, again, it's very heavy in starches. It's also fair amounts of meat. It's veggies, obviously. Whatever we can grow in Austria, would be typically.
Yeah.
Naturally produced, and not cold pressed, at the farm next door. So we always had seed oil, certain seed oils, but now when you talk about seed oils, most people don't differentiate between, well, what is a cold pressed pumpkin seed oil versus canola oil that find at Publix here.
Absolutely. And yeah, I mean, I don't have a problem with like some of these cold pressed oils in small amounts and especially they're not really heated much. If you're talking about on a salad, or I think this was from Austria. This dude a couple weeks ago gave me a little dessert. He had some ice cream with pumpkin seed oil on it or black
Yeah,
pumpkin
that
seed oil.
yeah, yeah, that's
Right?
that's
Isn't that a
exactly what.
thing over
Yeah,
there?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Really good.
exactly
Really
it
tasty.
it it I mean, if you make, like, a tomato cream soup or whatever, and you add that pumpkin seed oil, and I mean, and maybe some pumpkin seeds, absolutely delicious. I mean, it's a delicacy, in Austria, that pumpkin seed oil, and but again, first of all, you don't have that every day. You don't cook any meal with pumpkin seed oil, you use it cold. That's already a difference from you don't get oxidized poof as likely, or not as many as if you
Mhm.
were to use canola oil to fry your eggs. And so there's a lot of, like, nuance that's just different. And one of the things I believe that Austria still has been, or the EU in general has been holding on to, is to not allow a lot of additives that are allowed over here.
Mhm.
Food additives, that is. preservatives, those type of things.
Mm.
They have them, obviously. They are, I told you before we got on the call here that glyphosate is still allowed in the European Union, which is mind-boggling to me, knowing that everything that we know. But there are many, many other things. If you just look at the amount of chemicals in our food supply here in the US and compare it with Europe, Europe has a fraction. And one could argue that probably also plays a role. And one thing that we didn't mention before is because we said, yes, there is higher rates of cardiovascular disease and cancer, but obesity, on the other hand, is significantly less prevalent. Only 17% of adults in Austria are obese, whereas 40.3% are obese here in the US. So it's funny to see that, we have a lot of obesity, and a lot of people think, well, if you're fat, then, you're going to get heart disease and cancer and stroke and whatever. But that's not necessary. There's not necessarily a direct correlation. You can be not obese and suffer those consequences, or be
Yeah.
obese and not suffer them.
Yes. So this kind of ties into this concept of the personal fat thresholds, which I've covered on podcasts with Dr. Ted Naiman years ago, not the recent one, probably Dr. Ben Bickman. And this is something I learned about. It was like fascinating to me because I learned that India and China have tons of diabetes and they're pretty thin. And they have
Yeah,
tons of strokes and different problems, even though they're relatively thin, low BMI. And so it's kind of the skinny fat, right? It's
yeah.
like you can be skinny fat or this tofu, it's thin on the outside, fat on the inside. And
Yeah,
it's because of the personal fat thresholds that genetically different cultures have a different personal fat threshold, which means
yes.
they have the ability or not ability to grow more fat cells to deal with all this extra energy people are eating, right? People are
Yes.
eating in excess energy. And so some people, some races, some people can be gigantic and still not have diabetes,
Yeah,
right? And it's so confusing. And some people can be skinny and have diabetes. And it's because they genetically have the ability to make more fat cells or not. So basically, that's what the personal fat threshold is. And it
yeah.
makes a lot of sense. It's like diabetes and all these problems happen when there's not enough room to store the extra energy you've
Right.
eaten, right? Then it gets
Yes. Uh-huh.
inflamed, then it goes into visceral fat, and then it becomes inflammatory, all that stuff. So yeah, these people just don't have the ability to make a lot of subcutaneous fat, so they're getting a lot of visceral fat, and they have the little, like, belly going, so they're skinny, they have the little belly, their organs have all this visceral fat around them, and then they get heart disease, and they get
Yeah.
diabetes and all that.
Yeah. Yeah. Very
So
true.
that's what's happening in Austria. It's just people must be just having a lot of visceral fat and not and so they can get heart disease at a lower body size.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. But that was interesting. I would not have expected the discrepancy between the US and Austria, especially when it comes to the leading causes of death. But it really, goes to show that, Europe generally is behind. Most countries are behind the US on many things, the good and the bad. And I've noticed that every time I go to Austria, every year I go, it becomes more and more comparable to the US. Not in a good way, as
Yeah.
far as diet is concerned, as far as, stress is concerned, and many other things. And it's really I think the older generation that kind of skews the numbers a little bit into the positive, because they've had a long period for doing things differently and better. And now the younger generation that, grow up with all of the same kind of issues and lifestyle choices that we make over here in the US, they're going to suffer the consequences significantly sooner. They're not going to grow 90 years old.
Oh, it's scary, yeah. They're getting way more of it way quicker, and their bodies just go haywire, like, way quicker, and I have noticed this too. Many countries, they're kinda like 15 years behind the US in our disease states,
Hmm.
where and they're also adopting our food pyramids and stuff, right? Like,
Yeah.
it's like you just said, this insane food pyramid that doesn't make sense, and these countries keep adopting it and then getting sick like Americans, they're just behind us,
Yeah.
and I
I-
think that's even what's happening in Africa when I was with the Hadza, the Maasai, like, if you get out, like, into villages, not even the hunter-gatherers, but just, villages where people are just living sort of farm type lives, they're 30 years behind America, but then you see it creeping in.
mhm.
You know what I mean? It's like all it is is like, how fast are you gonna get all these processed foods and processed
Yeah.
ingredients, and then that's how quick you're gonna get disease. But it is creeping in, where I remember talking about these people in these farmers markets, these ladies, and they just started getting all these cooking oils in, and you could see them, they have these jugs of cooking oils, and then they're
Mhm.
starting to use, more flour. They didn't have junk food yet, but they had all the
Yeah.
cooking oils
Yeah.
and, maybe some, like, flour and, a bit of sugar. And once they got into their 40s, there was just a lot of very obese women, especially, or men too, and they had the bellies. But
Mhm.
they all the younger people below 40 were fine,
Yeah.
right? So
Mhm.
it's like it's just it's starting, it's coming in later, and they get away with it while they're younger,
Yes.
but then now, as a whole, they're getting these diseases and things just a bit later. It's just pushed back a bit.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely true, and so I think it's I mean, for my family, obviously, I'm not gonna change the way my grandmother lives, I just roll along with the punches, whatever she cooks, I eat. But with the younger generation, like my brother and stuff, he's very involved and he, obviously follows what we do and how we do things. And I can see that, they are making changes. They are doing things differently, and I think they'll benefit from that in the long run. Whereas everyone else who just follows along and you know will suffer the consequences. And it's a shame, especially because it seems like the persons in, or the people in power, like the government, they come up with those crazy food pyramids and avoid meat, and it's bad for so many things. It's bad for your health, it's bad for the planet, bad for the environment. I'm like, under what rock have you been living? I mean, it's the information is out there and everyone just follows, I guess, what's coming out of the US, and it's
Well, yeah, there's a lot of big industries funding all of this study, these research. There's a lot of agendas out there. I get it. Like, you have to just take it into your own hands and do your own thing. You can't listen to these mainstream sources. There's too much money propping up this system, right, and continuing it. So you just can't listen to them. But well, I want to ask, yeah, how do you eat? How do you feed your family? You have, I think, 2 kids. Is that right?
Yeah, we have 2 kids, they're homeschooled, so we try to keep them away from a lot of the influence we don't agree with and try to shape, you know, their view of the world that's more appropriate based on our beliefs.
Mhm.
But we follow an animal-based diet. We do not only animal-based, so we follow a lot of the concept of, Dr. Bill Schindler, like, how you eat is important as much as what you eat. But seasonally, stuff that we can grow, we try to grow as much as we possibly can. I mentioned before we are moving to a larger property so we can raise ruminants and also
Oh, we didn't talk
monogastric
about
animals.
that live on air yet. So yeah, so you're on like a acre and a quarter. You have a lot of small animals, but you're gonna
Yes.
move.
Yeah, so right now we have predominantly, rabbits are a source of red meat. I mean, they're not ruminants, hindgut fermenters, but still it's red enough.
Mhm.
Better than chicken meat. We raise chickens, turkeys, guineas. We have honeybees, for to make our own honey. And we try to produce as much as we can with a garden as well, but the goal really is to raise ruminant meat, beef, um, sheep, goats, as well as pigs. I really love pork, but not the pork that's sold in stores.
Mhm.
And so we really want to take this on into our own hand and follow a more seasonal approach of, okay, what grows around us and when does it grow? Whenever that is, that's what we eat, and as little else as possible. I think you don't have to. There is a lot of discussion about, okay, what's the best diet? Keto or carnivore or paleo or any animal based or vegan, whatever. If you just look at what's growing during a certain time of the year and what you can potentially grow yourself or hunt or harvest, that's likely an ideal diet for you. And that means that in winter, it's probably more of a lower carb approach, right, than it is in summer when
Mhm.
sweet fruits and stuff are growing. And so that's kind of the how we approach that whole diet
That's
framework.
sapien right there. I
That's
mean,
sapient right there.
that's what sapien's all
Mhm.
about, and everything you're doing is sapien, really. Even the homeschooling and the philosophy of living closer to how we're supposed to live. That's great. So you're in Georgia, and you
Yes.
have you got 45 acres, or you're moving soon, or what is the deal?
Yeah, we're gonna move at the end of October, beginning of November. We're actually gonna move into a quote unquote, well, two tiny homes joined together. We're trying to keep it as simple and as non-toxic as possible with actual copper pipes, for a water
Mm.
supply instead of PEX and some of the other things that are used in modern homes now. And try to just spend as much as time outdoors as possible. If you don't have enough living room indoors, then you're forced to spend more time outdoors,
That's a
right?
hack right there. Just have
Yeah,
a
yeah.
tiny home. There we go.
And it's cheaper too, and I don't have a mortgage. I mean, there is just so many, like, if you think about it, what it means to live a, happy, relatively stress-free life, if you don't need to worry about paying a lot of bills every single month, if you grow your, I mean, for us, the biggest expenditures are home, car, and food, right? If we can take care of our food, if we don't have a mortgage and, a car that's paid off, we're in pretty good shape, already. I mean, with solar panels, with battery, to produce some of our own energy as much as possible. With our own water on the property, there's really going back to, again, not living in a hut in a loincloth, but
Hmm.
adopting as much of those old principles, and de-stress and really be involved in the food production. I think that's what we'd like to do.
That's so cool. Yeah, you're setting an example. I mean, not everyone's gonna go homestead though, too, but you don't have to. I mean, you can do some of these things without homesteading, right?
You can do a lot of the things without, I mean, homesteading can mean a lot of things. You don't need to live off the grid necessarily. There are those who take it to the extreme, the purists, but you can do it in a way that, homesteading might just mean, well, you have enough space for a small veggie garden and a couple of chickens. You're homesteading. It's really about the idea and the ideology of taking control of your own life ultimately, but certain parts of your life that are important for your health, right? It does it matter where I get my cherries from? Maybe not. But if I can take care of my meat supply, which is I eat the most, I'm in significantly better shape than I would be otherwise. But the other nuance of that is, a lot of people think that, well, I could never or I could not do this. And I think I'm not special. I'm not particularly smart or
Hmm.
was not particularly lucky in any, event or time in my life. If I can do it, anyone can do it. And so I think it's the barriers we build for ourselves sometimes, where we say, well, we cannot move because of the kids' school. I mean, that's really a big thing for many people, that they cannot move out of the city because of the school district, right? Well, I'm like, well, what if we don't? If What if we homeschool our kids? Suddenly the school district becomes irrelevant. And homeschooling doesn't necessarily mean that you become the teacher, right? If you go back to the sapient principle of raising and educating kids, it's not about them sitting, on a desk for 8 hours a day. It's about it's about not being in their way of learning. Every
Mm.
human wants to learn if given the opportunity, right? If you watch kids, you don't have to, send a kid to school to learn how to walk, right? They just do it if you let them, if you enable them, right? And the same goes with teaching our kids. And now that our kids are out of school, I'm like, well, and I work from home, my wife is home. Suddenly, we can go wherever we want to. We could be in a van for what it's worth and drive around the country, if we wanted to do that. But so you remove a barrier where maybe 10 years ago would have said, well, we could never do this. Well, we can't because we are putting roadblocks in our way. And if
Mm.
you start removing those roadblocks, then suddenly you realize you can do whatever the heck you want to.
Yeah. And you can still socialize with other kids. Is that, I mean, people say, "Oh, they're gonna turn out weird," or I mean, isn't there still like community sports or events you can do?
Yeah, first of all, certainly. I mean, even if you homeschool the kids, you can. There is, at least here in Georgia, by law, they can be part of of school sports and stuff. So you can sign them up for the school soccer team.
Mm.
But there are now so many homesteading groups, depending on where you live, that you can join. If you're out in the country, there are farmer kids, who, they have like other activities. It might not be, pickleball or whatever you're used to in your city. It might be something else, but there is always, and I would argue, especially out in the countryside, community is much higher valued than maybe
Mm.
here in the city. We know two of our neighbors, but they're not our friends. We don't see them every day. Yeah, I mean, we might see them, but we are not really, they're not our community. And we live in the middle of, there are a lot of people around us, but they're not necessarily a community.
Oh,
And
I know
so,
what you mean. But if you live out there, like, you really do have community, you find the people, and they find activities. That's like
yeah,
you have, like, the swimming holes, you know what I mean? You're just, like,
yeah,
playing capture the flag, you're playing hide and go seek.
yeah. You're doing the things that we did when we were young, in
Absolutely.
instead of being, signed up for 50 after school activities that stresses everybody out because you have to drive from A to B, every single day. I mean, that's community, yes, but is it the type of community that humans need? I would argue maybe not.
Yeah. Well, hopefully people can take this information and try to do something if they live in the city, because I don't wanna make it like, "Oh, man, everyone's gotta just go homestead." Right? Like,
Right.
you still do you have any other ideas for people if they do live in the city, how they can just have more community or do different things like this? You go to your farmer's market, you can identify some ranchers that do things properly and get the meat, stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, there is a lot of farmers, they need help, and if you want to get involved and just build community in the homesteading farming kind of, realm without you being a farmer as well or a homesteader as well, I mean, just go and help and maybe get, food in return. I mean, that's how things have worked back in the days as well, where you exchange stuff instead of, trading money, you trade your time maybe for products and you learn stuff in the process. Maybe then you learn about opportunities. There are a lot of the homesteaders that we follow, they don't own the land. They rent the land or they get it for free because the landowner realizes that if someone does practices regenerative farming on that land, the land quality and the soil quality is going to improve. And I'm going to get this for free by just allowing this guy to run, his ruminants on my land.
Mhm.
So there are so many ways on how you build community or can, participate in that thing without necessarily owning land.
That's a good point. Yeah, I've heard of the things like bartering or you can just try to meet some people even at a farmer's market, and then, "Hey, do you need help? Can I bring my kids? Can we just, like, help you?"
Yeah,
Like, can we learn? Can we, just see what it's like to pick some vegetables, whatever.
yeah. And what we do is, on our once we move to our new property, we are going to make available our tiny home once we built our permanent home. We first thought let's turn it into a business and turn it into an Airbnb with a whole farm experience at the whole 9 yards. But I'm like, okay, that could work and it's probably gonna make money and stuff. But you know what? We're gonna give it to someone who in return is gonna live there and help us on the farm. So we have
Mm,
still the opportunity to travel because my wife's Costa Rican, I'm Austrian. We still go to our respective countries. And if we have someone there who helps us every day, then suddenly that whole homesteading doesn't become another stressor because you have to be there every day and do things. Otherwise, your animals are going to suffer or whatever. So you reduce your stress, you build community, and you give and you get something in return. And I'm like, those are like the things where I'm like, yeah, not from a business perspective, but just from an overall quality of life perspective, that's the much smarter choice for us to offer shelter to someone who will then help us on the farm, you know?
that's it. That's actually a great solution, and, man, that's awesome. So, it sounds like you're, like, the ultimate sapien then. I was thinking of,
I don't know
like
about
no, no, you're 43, you look amazing, you're fit, you're doing the whole thing with your family, you're eating like, you figured it out. I love it. What else do you do? I know you make some supplements, but the good kind that are real food
that.
based.
Yeah, yeah. So, yeah, we have the, organ meats and animal-based supplements, generally speaking, I wanna say. We just introduced bison supplements because I love bison. I mean, that's really the ultimate, American animal. But beyond that, we also started with, we drink coffee quite a bit. And I know that, some people hate coffee, some people really think it's, a
Mhm.
superfood. I don't think it's either. I just happen to like it.
Yeah.
Um, but I also like clean coffee, and we learned again through building community that my mother-in-law's high school friend from Costa Rica has their own coffee plantation, very
Mm,
small. They only produce like 1,000 kilograms a year. And so we started now importing that coffee and selling it because it has not seen any pesticides in over 50 years. That land
mm,
is. They don't use anything regeneratively, eco-friendly and organic and the whole 9 yards. Basically, the best quality. I mean, there are other high quality coffees out there, but there is nothing that could top this coffee, and it
yep.
also tastes good. And so we started, importing that coffee. So that's another kind of, thing. I'm like, okay, something that I consume every single day, I want to be involved and know exactly where it comes from. If it was something that I drink once a month or whatever, I don't care. I just go and buy it.
Yeah.
But something that is a regular part of my diet, I want to have some sort of control or at least insight over to know exactly where it comes from. And so that's another thing that we do. But most of the time is really spent between raising animals, teaching the kids, or allowing enabling them, and and sharing then all the information on blog. And we have a separate homesteading channel that we will only talk about the homesteading part, and then the biohacking side, which is like the main channel. And then bringing those things really together to make sure that we're doing as much right as we possibly can. And
I love it. I love it.
uh,
And yeah, I did the same thing with the oyster pills. I don't like supplements, so the only thing I take is these oyster pills. And I found the guy that from Ireland doing it the best way, like
yeah.
pure
Uh-huh.
Irish. And man, these oysters are crazy. I got my blood test back. My testosterone went up huge. I have like
Oh
the
yeah.
testosterone of a 20-year-old. It's great. Yeah, it just has all the precursors that you need. So
Yes.
yeah, I do like, let's be mindful, get a clean animal base, pure real food type of supplement, and otherwise we can just do it with just eating whole foods.
Yeah, I mean, in reality, if you eat animals nose to tail, you don't need a supplement. You can eat. I mean, there are no oysters around where I live, so that might be a good exception. But liver or heart or whatever, you can eat raw and fresh, or not raw. You don't have to eat it raw, but you can eat it fresh and find it fresh. It's just that most people, unfortunately, don't like it. But it's really one of those things where you know, try it out. Try pate maybe mix it into meatballs, into ground meat, whatever, and just get it into your diet one way or the other. It can be very easy, but worst case scenario, yeah, get a good high quality supplement.
Yep, that's it. And yeah, so you have a big YouTube channel. You're on the different social medias. Is it
Yeah.
just under your name? People find you, Michael
Yeah,
Kummer?
it's either Michael Kummer, M Kummer 82 is my handle on most or on many social platforms like Twitter or X and Instagram and stuff. But under Michael Kummer, you typically find me as well. There are not too many Michael Kummers.
That's Kummer.
Correct.
And man, Sapien right here. Michael Kummer, the ultimate Sapien, your inspiration. I love it. And thanks, man.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.